All right, welcome back to New Testament Survey. We're going to continue our discussion of the general introduction to the New Testament by just talking about the New Testament itself. What is it composed of? What's it made up of? And I want to give you this image here, and I can have this image available in Populi as well, so you could download just this particular image, not from the video. But if you look through this image, you can see the general makeup of the entire Bible, of course, Old Testament and New Testament. The word testament itself simply means covenant or promise. And of course, that really comes from the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, verses 7 through 12. I encourage you to look that up, read through that, how the writer of the book of Hebrews talks about the Old Testament or the Old Covenant that the Hebrews were under, that the Jews were under, of course, meaning specifically the law of Moses, and this New Testament, this new covenant that Jesus had established in his blood, that is now being established, that frees us from that law and gives us forgiveness of sins. And so the New Testament here, as we talk about these 27 books, and if you want to do a little memorization here, that if you want to know how many books are there in the New Testament, you can take the words New Testament, two words, New and Testament, and break it up into the number of letters that are in each word. So if you look at the Old Testament, there are 3 letters in the word Old and 9 letters in the word Testament. That gives you 39 books. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. If you look at the New Testament, one of the key concepts of the New Testament is the Great Commission, which is we are to make disciples, and those disciples are to make disciples. And so a key concept of the New Testament is what we call multiplication. We are to multiply ourselves by evangelizing and discipling. And so if you think about multiplication, you take the 3 letters in the word New, 9 letters in the word Testament. 3 times 9 equals 27. There's 27 books in the New Testament. And that's broken down in 5 major categories. You have the Gospels. There are 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the book of Acts, which is kind of sometimes just talked about as the book of history, or the history of the church. Then you have the Pauline epistles, and there are 13 of those, Romans through 2 Thessalonians. Then you have what's called the general epistles, or sometimes called the Catholic epistles. These are the epistles, the letters that were written by people other than Paul. Book of Hebrews all the way through the book of Jude. And then we have another single book, the book of Revelation, which is written by John, and kind of stands alone as what we call an apocalypse, which when we get to the book of Revelation, we'll talk about that. I want to also talk a little bit about the writers of the New Testament. There were 9 men who wrote the New Testament. Several of them were originally apostles, were disciples of Jesus who walked and spoke with him and talked with him. You have Matthew, you have John, you have Peter. All spoke with Jesus, all talked with Jesus, all lived in the time of Jesus. Then you have a couple of guys who are let's look at their occupations as well. You have John, who was a fisherman. James and John, the sons of Zebedee. That's the same John that we see in the Gospels. He wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. You have Matthew, the tax collector, who was one of the 12. And as you read through the book of Matthew, you can see some of his work there. Then you have the gospel written by Mark. Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, but rather was a young man. And as we get into the book of Mark, when we get to that place in our study, we'll find out that young man is the same young man that's presented in the Gospel of Mark, that's not named, but who followed Jesus into the garden the night that he was betrayed, and then, of course, was wearing a blanket and then eventually ran away naked. And you see that in the Gospel of Mark. Luke, who also wrote a gospel, was also not one of Jesus's disciples. Probably Luke was a Gentile. We see that in the book of Galatians. And again, we'll be covering all of this when we get to each individual book. But I just want to talk about it in general here. Luke was a physician, a doctor in those days. He was a companion of Paul's. And of course, according to the book of Colossians, Luke was probably a Gentile. And came much later than the apostles there. All right. Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And some have considered Luke and Acts as companions, as coming together or working together in one whole. And again, we'll talk about all of this when we get to those books. Then you come to Paul. Paul was not one of the original apostles, but as he proclaims for himself, he was an apostle as if born out of order. He was or sometimes people call him the 13th apostle. And we'll talk a little bit more about how he's an apostle as compared to the 12. A little bit later, we'll talk about the life of Paul as well. He wrote several different books, 13 books altogether. Many of those were to churches, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he wrote to the Corinthians twice, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were all written to churches. Then he wrote also to several individuals, to Timothy, 2 times, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and to Philemon. Then you have the general epistles were written by various people. You have the book of Hebrews, who we do not have a definitive answer. Some believe that Paul wrote it. Some believe that perhaps Barnabas wrote it. But we do not have a specific writer for the book of Hebrews. And we'll talk about that when we get to the book of Hebrews as well. That brings us then to James. This is not James, the brother of John, but rather James, the brother of Jesus. James is the half-brother of Jesus, a son of Mary and Joseph, whereas Jesus, of course, is only the biological son of Mary. And he introduces himself as such. James was one of the first leaders in the Jerusalem church. And of course, you have Peter, also a fisherman, Peter the apostle. We see him all throughout the Gospels, wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. We already talked about John having written 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation. And then finally here we have the book of Jude, also written by Jesus' half-brother, Judas, although we call him Jude just to clear up any misunderstandings about Judas, the one who would betray, and Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote a book. All right, that's all we have for the overview of the various New Testament books. In our next video, we're going to talk about the inspiration of the New Testament.